Oh, hello there. You're just in time. I was about to drift off again, but if you're here, I suppose I could tell you about another one of my quiet little adventures. You know, the kind with hammocks, soft breezes, old stones, not much else going on. Just the way I like it. If this is your first time joining me, welcome. My name's Clyde. I travel through time, but not for the reasons most people would think. I don't fix anything. I don't chase villains. I don't really do much of anything, to be honest. I simply go and sit and watch. And sometimes nap. Actually, a lot of napping, you'll see. There's a whole playlist of these sleepy, uneventful journeys. What I like to call my boring adventures. If you'd like to hear more of them, feel free to give this a like and maybe even subscribe. Best to do it now, before your eyes get heavy and you forget. And if you really enjoy drifting through time with me, you can become a channel member. It's a quiet little way to support the work I do, and as a thank you, I'll make you your own personalized, sleepy story. One just for you. But for now, let me tell you about the time I accidentally fell asleep in a hammock in the hanging gardens of Babylon. Yes, those gardens. They were taller than I expected, and somehow softer too. Anyway, we'll get to that. Let's begin. It was late afternoon when I arrived. Not that I really had an appointment or anything. I never do. I just sort of showed up the way I usually do, and blinked my eyes open to find myself at the base of a vast, sun-warmed wall, layered in cascading ivy and flowering vines that seemed to drape like silk. At first, I wasn't even sure if it was the hanging gardens. You hear all these grand stories growing up, lush terraces, engineered marvels, Queen Ametis and her homesickness for green hills, and then you get there and realize the gardens weren't loud. They were quiet, deliberate, peaceful in the same way that moss grows on stone or how you fall asleep with a book on your chest. The first thing I did was wander into a shaded alcove filled with fig trees and little pools that mirrored the sky in puddles of blue. There was a goat sleeping under one of the trees. It didn't seem alarmed by me. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a more judgmental goat. It gave me a single glance, chewed very slowly on something dry and twig-like, and then proceeded to yawn directly in my direction. "All right," I said, mostly to the goat. Message received. I kept walking. There were olive trees, pomegranate bushes, delicate ferns, and even a few fat frogs balancing on broad lily leaves in shallow basins of water. The air smelled damp, earthy, like river clay and crushed mint with just the faintest trace of sun-warmed stone. It was then I saw it. A hammock, just hanging there between two slender columns wrapped in flowering vines. It wasn't even taut. One side sagged a little, like it had already made peace with the idea of taking a nap. Of course I got in. Wouldn't you? It creaked a little under my weight, and for a moment I thought I'd go tumbling to the ground, which would have been a fitting start. But no. It held me gently. The sky above was pale and drowsy. A few birds flitted overhead, small, dusty things that chirped with no real urgency. I folded my arms behind my head and stared upward through the dangling green. I thought about, well, not much. There was a broken clay bowl nearby with a few dates still in it. I considered eating one, but got distracted by a beetle with absolutely no sense of direction. It circled the rim 3 times before finally flinging itself off the edge like it had made a dramatic decision. I didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed. Somewhere nearby, I heard water moving, maybe from one of those ancient Archimedes-style screws or buckets that looped around lifting water from the Euphrates into the upper levels. It sounded like someone gently pouring a jug of water forever. I could have stayed there for hours. Actually, I did. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for a little bird to land on my boot, look disappointed, and fly off again. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I rolled lazily out of the hammock with a sort of wobble that could only be described as plant-adjacent. You know when you've been still for so long, your body forgets how to do upright things. That was me. A stretch, a yawn, and one sandal that had somehow filled with a leaf. I followed the sound of trickling water, weaving my way through rows of papyrus and creeping thyme, until I found what I can only describe as a wooden screw. Now that might sound odd, but it really was a giant spiral, wrapped around a hollow pole, rotating slowly. Buckets or troughs were attached all along its length, and as it turned, it scooped water up from below and poured it gently into a stone basin at the top. It was mesmerizing, and ancient, and entirely too complicated for me to think about without needing another nap. There was a man nearby who looked in charge of it. He wore a kind of wrap around his waist and a large, crooked smile. He seemed to be oiling the mechanism with some kind of sticky resin, muttering under his breath in what I think was Akkadian, though don't quote me on that. I waved. He waved back, and then went right on muttering, unfazed by the presence of a sleepy man in a cloak, who quite literally appeared out of nowhere. That's one thing I've learned across centuries. People are generally too busy with their own odd tasks to worry about a stranger standing nearby, staring at moving water. I sat down beside a potted tree, possibly tamarisk, but I wouldn't stake my life on it, and watched for a while. The screw made a soft, creaking rhythm, like a lullaby sung by a machine made of wood and vines. Water lifted. Water poured. Repeat. There was a stray sandal hanging from one of the buckets. No explanation. I did not ask. Nearby, a cat batted lazily at a falling leaf, decided it was too much effort, and curled back up on a warm stone. I started to doze again, sitting upright this time. One eye open, then the other closed too, and the water just kept climbing uphill. At some point, not long after my semi-conscious nap by the irrigation screw, I became aware of someone standing nearby, not threatening or anything, just standing, breathing through their nose in a vaguely impatient way. I opened one eye and found myself staring at a man in a long, layered tunic, arms crossed, holding 2 bananas. He didn't say anything. He just raised one of the bananas as if to say, "Do you want this or not?" So I sat up and nodded, and he tossed it over with surprisingly good aim. We sat together for a bit, he on a moss-covered step, me cross-legged on the warm stone, still half draped in my cloak. He didn't speak, and neither did I. It was, I have to say, one of the most polite banana-sharing experiences I've ever had. Eventually, though, he broke the silence by saying something very slowly in what sounded like a mix of Old Persian and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe Elamite? And somehow, I understood. He asked, "What is it like, not knowing where you're going, but going anyway?" Now that's a question, especially from a man with banana on his lip. I gave him the only honest answer I had. It's confusing, but also kind of peaceful, like walking through fog barefoot and not worrying about what you might step on. He considered this, then shrugged, then peeled his second banana. Turned out he was some kind of local philosopher, or maybe just the kind of guy who loiters near water screws waiting to ask strangers riddles. Either way, we got along just fine. He told me that sometimes he taught the children of the palace, not officially, more like whoever wandered over and asked what the stars meant or why frogs screamed at night, which is a thing, apparently. Babylonian frogs, he claimed, made an awful screech when frightened. I didn't challenge it. I didn't really want to know. Instead, I looked up through the overhanging vines and thought about how little I understood about this place, its systems, its cycles, its frogs. But I was comfortable and full of banana. which is more than most philosophers can say at the end of the day. After the philosopher wandered off, presumably to deliver more fruit-based wisdom elsewhere, I found myself alone again, which for me is ideal. Solitude is like a warm cloak on a breezy day. I wandered up a set of steps that were more plant than stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and the occasional tumble of a careless gardener. At the top, I found a terrace lined with clay pots and wide stone benches, some of them so sun-bleached they looked like they'd forgotten what color they once were. That's where I met Nebo, not a person, a lizard. He was about the size of a pencil, one of the short ones you use down to a nub but can't quite throw away. And he had a tail that twitched as if it had its own separate agenda. I don't know what drew him to me. Maybe I smelled like banana. Maybe he just appreciated the lack of sudden movement. Either way, he climbed up onto the bench beside me, blinked at me with one of those slow, disapproving lizard blinks, and then just stayed there. For a good half hour, I named him Nebo after the Babylonian god of wisdom. I figured, if you're going to have a lizard sit next to you in one of the ancient wonders of the world, you may as well show some respect. Nebo had this habit of flicking his tongue at things that clearly weren't bugs. At one point, he licked a pebble, looked personally betrayed, and walked in a circle like he needed to reset the whole day. I offered him a bit of dried fig I had tucked in my cloak. He ignored it, of course. Philosophical lizards don't eat gifts from strangers. That's just basic lizard etiquette. While we sat there, the sun began to dip slightly. Still warm, but with that golden hue that makes even cracked pots look poetic. The vines on the railing swayed in a breeze I hadn't noticed until then. And somewhere far below, I could hear someone singing. A woman, maybe, or a boy. The voice was high and soft, and I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. It sounded like honey being poured over time itself. Nebo crept closer to the edge, peered over, then looked back at me as if to say, "Don't fall." I didn't, but I did lean back, close my eyes, and listen to the garden breathe. Not long after Nebo scuttled off, perhaps summoned by some lizard council, I found myself wandering again. The terraces twisted like a gentle maze, and the plants thickened in spots where the sun hit just right. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone muttering. Not angrily, not sadly, just with great focus. I followed the sound until I found her. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, crouched in front of a line of small stones she'd arranged in an uneven curve. Beside her sat a wide basket filled entirely with what looked like more rocks, some smooth, some chipped. A few looked freshly plucked from the edge of the irrigation channels. She looked up at me, squinted, then pointed at one of the stones. "This one's the queen." I nodded because, of course it was. "And this one's a goat. He's very fast." I sat down cross-legged a little ways away, giving her enough space to continue her arrangement without feeling interrupted. She resumed her task, whispering elaborate instructions to the rock goat, who apparently had to cross 3 tiles, avoid a frog, and protect the queen from a bird. I didn't catch all the rules. I don't think she knew all the rules. At one point, she held up a stone with a reddish stripe running through it and said very seriously, "This one's dangerous. He smells like onions." Naturally, I made a respectful noise and leaned back against a mossy wall. The garden around us was quiet, save for a few bird-song loops and the low hum of insects that didn't seem to want anything from us. A few bees floated lazily through the air, entirely disinterested in the human world. Eventually, the girl stood, lifted the basket with both hands, and gave me a formal nod. "I have to go. The rocks need sunlight." Who was I to argue? She trotted off around the corner, the stones rattling gently in their woven nest. I imagined her laying them out one by one along a sunlit step somewhere. preparing them for their next mysterious journey. And I sat there for a while longer, in the company of a forgotten queen, a goat, and a faint smell of imaginary onions. Eventually, I found myself near the outer edge of the gardens. The air was different there, less humid, more open. The scents shifted from the thick green of vines to the dry sweetness of sun-baked clay and distant river breeze. I stood in front of a stone wall, ancient and worn, partially overtaken by moss. At its base was a wide, shallow pool reflecting the shifting sky. Bronze clouds, slivers of blue, the flicker of a passing bird. I crouched beside it and picked up a flat pebble. And I did the thing we all instinctively do, no matter the century. I tried to skip it. It plopped immediately. No skips. The pool was unimpressed. Still, the act stirred something. Memories. Echoes. You see, the hanging gardens weren't just about plants and water. They were about memory. Everything there felt like it remembered something. The walls remembered laughter. The stones remembered sandals. Even the vines seemed to lean toward you when you whispered, just in case your words were worth keeping. I found a bench, half covered in creeping ivy, as most things were, and sat again. And that's when I heard it, a faint echo of my own humming. It had bounced off something in the curved wall behind me and come back slower, softer, like it had grown shy on the journey. So I hummed again, a different tune, and the echo played with me. We traded a few notes. I hummed, it answered. I whistled, it hesitated, then returned with something close enough. I don't know how long I sat there playing music with the stones. It felt like hours, or minutes, or both. Eventually, the echo faded. Perhaps it got bored, or maybe I did. The sky had begun to turn the color of roasted apricots. You know that warm, dusty orange that feels like a memory before it even finishes happening? That was the sky. And as I stood, brushing off imaginary dirt from clothes that hadn't gotten dirty, I said a soft goodbye. Not to anyone in particular, just to the wall, and the water, and the day. As the last bits of sunlight melted behind the terraces, I retraced my steps, or at least I tried to. It turns out the hanging gardens aren't just hanging, they're shifting. Not literally, of course, but in that way that ancient places sometimes do, where everything looks just familiar enough to fool you and just different enough to lose you. I passed a tree that I was certain had been on my left earlier in the day. Now it was somehow smugly on my right. I offered it a narrow glance. It offered no explanation. Eventually, though, the path widened, the stone felt warmer, and I spotted the telltale sag of the old hammock, still waiting patiently between the two vine-wrapped columns. The goat was gone, off to judge someone else, probably, but the bowl with the dates was still there. One more date had mysteriously disappeared. I didn't question it. The hammock welcomed me back like an old friend. A slightly squeaky friend, but one with good intentions. As I settled in, the vines overhead rustled slightly in the dusk breeze, and one particularly bold leaf landed on my chest like a sleepy moth. I left it there. It had earned it. The stars had begun to peek out now, one by one like timid children at the edge of a stage, and from somewhere deeper in the garden, I heard the soft metallic clink of a water wheel settling in for the night. I folded my hands over my chest, listened, breathed. Somewhere far away, the world was likely loud and glowing and buzzing. But here, among the terraces of hanging ferns and philosophical goats and girls with stone-based games, it was just stillness. And in that stillness, I finally allowed my eyes to close. Somewhere between being mostly asleep and only sort of conscious, I heard a sound. A very specific sound. The flapping of wings. A gentle, feathery thwump, thwump, thwump. I opened one eye, just barely, and saw him, a goose, standing about 6 feet away, perfectly still, perfectly suspicious. He was staring at me with the deep, contemplative glare of someone who was either about to deliver an ancient prophecy or bite my ankle. I sat up a little in the hammock and said softly, "Harold?" I don't know why I said it. It just felt right. The goose blinked once, then blinked again, then slowly tucked one leg up under himself and settled into the dirt like a soft, feathery beanbag. I took that as confirmation. Yes, this was Harold. Probably. We sat together in companionable silence as the sky deepened to velvet and a few stars began winking more boldly. Harold occasionally tilted his head toward a rustling sound, then back to me as if checking to make sure I hadn't disappeared. I reached down beside the hammock and found a small object half buried in the soil. It was a carved stone, smooth and rounded, with a spiral etched on its surface. Maybe a token, maybe a child's game piece, maybe something left by that girl and her royal onion-smelling rock army. I showed it to Harold. He honked once, not approving, not disapproving, just acknowledging. I placed it beside the date bowl, a sort of offering to Harold, to the garden, to time itself. The night had a rhythm now. Crickets, frogs, the occasional soft burble of water being lifted by tired old gears. And of course, Harold, guardian of the gravel path, sentinel of the fig tree, possibly a dream, probably not. But one thing I've learned, when a goose joins you in an ancient garden at night, you don't ask why, you just accept it. I must have dozed again. Not deeply, just that sort of shallow twilight drift where thoughts stretch like vines and time doesn't so much pass as puddle. When I opened my eyes, Harold was gone, vanished without so much as a honk. Only a single white feather remained where he'd been, resting like a bookmark in the story of the garden. I sat up fully now, stretching with the kind of effort that only comes after multiple partial naps. Somewhere off to my left, a breeze carried the soft tinkling of chimes, hollow clay tubes maybe, or bits of bronze strung together. And then I saw it. No, not saw. Felt. Above me, high along the garden's rear wall, was a strange silhouette, a zigzagging frame made of interlocked beams and climbing vines. It wasn't a ladder exactly, but it wasn't not a ladder either. Curious and still too sleepy to talk myself out of it, I wandered toward it. The steps were mossy. The vines smelled faintly of basil and something floral I couldn't name. I climbed slowly, the way one climbs when you're not in a hurry and aren't entirely sure whether climbing is what you're supposed to be doing. At the top, a platform, flat, round, and surrounded by wide clay planters overflowing with trailing greenery. From there, the garden stretched beneath me in layers and shadows. Pools caught reflections of the moon. The irrigation screw churned like a sleeping heartbeat, and at the very edge of the platform, someone had placed a chair, just one, old, wobbly, but perfectly positioned to look out over the Euphrates, winding far off in the distance like a dark ribbon. I sat. The chair creaked. I did too, and I thought about how many people had likely sat here, to think, to listen, to just be. I stayed for what might have been 5 minutes, or 30. Hard to tell from that high up. Below, the stars blinked back from the pools, and I felt not small, but well placed, like a stone finally settled in the right part of the path. I don't know what stirred me. Maybe the wind, or the coolness of the seat beneath me, or the subtle realization that the world was holding its breath. But I stood, slowly, quietly, as if I might startle the moon. I made my way down from the platform. back through the vine tunnel, past the planter with the stubborn basil. The garden felt even quieter now, as though it had finally fallen fully asleep. Even the frogs had stopped their conversations. Even the breeze had turned still. That's when I felt it. A hum, low, subtle, steady. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around the stone, the one I always carry, smooth, palm-sized. And now, faintly glowing, it never forces me to leave. It simply lets me know when it's time. The light wasn't bright, more like moonlight caught in a pebble, software, trustworthy. I walked back to the hammock. It was empty again, Harold gone, the leaf still resting where it had landed earlier. I picked it up and tucked it into my cloak, a souvenir of stillness. As I stood there, one last look over the garden filled my chest with something I can only describe as warm quiet, the kind of peace you don't find often. I didn't say goodbye. I never do. I just let the stone do what it does. It hummed a little stronger. The air shimmered. The stars leaned in. And just like that, I was somewhere else.